My mother set the album on the coffee table like she was presenting a trophy, 43 photographs. Every Christmas, every Easter, every summer at the Hamptons house. Every single Hughes family memory, printed, laminated, arranged in chronological order. I stood there and looked through every page. I was not in one single photograph, not cropped out, not blurred, simply never there. As though the last 32 years had happened entirely without me, my father picked up his glass of wine and said, in front of 11 relatives and 2 family friends, "This is what our family looks like. This is who we are." He did not look at me when he said it. I did not cry. I did not argue. I set my glass down on the coaster, picked up my coat from the chair, and walked to the door. What none of them knew, what my father could not have imagined as he smiled at that album, was that 3 weeks earlier, my grandfather had signed the final page of a document that made me the sole heir to everything the Hughes family had ever built, every acre, every account, every photograph on every wall. Before I tell you what happened next, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. And hit like and subscribe if you've ever been made to feel invisible by the people who were supposed to love you most. I should tell you about the house first, because everything that happened, every decision my parents made, every cruelty they thought they could get away with, was about that house. The Hughes estate sat on 4.5 acres in East Hampton, 300 feet from the water. My grandfather Edward had bought the land in 1971 for what he called an embarrassing amount of money that turned out to be the smartest thing I ever did. By the time I was born, the property was worth more than most people earn in lifetimes. The main house had 7 bedrooms, a library my grandfather used every single day, and a kitchen that smelled like cedar and coffee no matter what time you walked in. There was a guest cottage, a boathouse, and a garden my grandmother Margaret had planted herself before she died in 2004. After Margaret died, the house became the thing the family orbited. Every holiday, every birthday, every gathering that needed to feel important happened there. My grandfather insisted on it. He said the house was not about money. It was about memory. He meant that sincerely. Edward Hughes was one of those rare people who had accumulated significant wealth and somehow remained completely unimpressed by it. My parents were not like that. Richard and Diane Hughes had spent 31 years of their marriage in careful, calculated proximity to Edward's money. They did not spend recklessly. That was not their style. Their style was subtler. They positioned. They reminded. They made themselves indispensable in ways that were easy to miss unless you were paying attention. My father managed Edward's calendar. My mother organized his medical appointments, his prescriptions, his grocery deliveries. They were always there, always helpful, always just slightly too present. My sister Brooke understood this instinctively. Brooke was 3 years older than me and had inherited our mother's talent for making herself essential. She called Edward every Sunday. She sent flowers on the anniversary of Margaret's death. She drove him to his cardiologist in the city 4 times a year and sat in the waiting room with a coffee and a crossword, patient and attentive, and exactly what a devoted granddaughter was supposed to look like. Edward appreciated it. He told her so, and Brooke made sure the rest of us knew he had said it. I was not good at any of that. I don't mean I didn't love my grandfather. I loved him more than almost anyone I have ever known. But my way of showing it looked different. When I visited, we didn't make small talk. We sat in his library and he asked me what I was reading, what I was working on, what I thought about things. He had opinions about architecture, about design, about why most modern buildings made him feel like he was trapped outside a spreadsheet. I had opinions back. We argued pleasantly for hours. I redesigned the library layout when I was 26, rearranged the shelving, added a reading nook under the east window, reupholstered the 2 armchairs in a dark green wool that he said made the room feel like it finally made sense. He never stopped talking about those chairs. That was how we were together. Quiet, specific. Real. My parents did not know what to do with that. In the Hughes household, there was an unspoken but completely consistent set of rules that operated on 2 separate tracks, one for Brooke and one for me. When Brooke made the honor roll, it was framed and hung in the hallway. When I made the honor roll the following year, my mother said, "Well, you always did well on tests." When Brooke got into NYU, my parents threw a dinner party. When I got a full scholarship to study interior architecture at Cornell, my father said, "Cornell. Is that the right fit for you, do you think?" I was 17. I didn't know what he meant. I understand now that he didn't mean anything except that my success made him uncomfortable, in ways he had never examined closely enough to name. The scapegoat role in a family like mine is not assigned all at once. It accumulates. It's 100 small redirections, 100 moments where the blame finds you first, 100 dinners where your opinion arrives a half second too late to be heard. By the time I was an adult, I had internalized most of it without realizing I had. I kept my visits to the Hamptons house brief. I built a life in the city, a small apartment in Brooklyn, a freelance practice that had grown steadily into something I was genuinely proud of, a handful of clients who trusted me completely. I did not need my family's approval to function, but I will not pretend I did not still want it. That was my mistake, maybe. Wanting something from people who had already decided what I was worth. Edward saw it. He saw everything, actually. That was the thing about my grandfather that people underestimated because he moved slowly and spoke quietly and had turned 81 in March. He watched my parents with the calm attention of a man who had built a business from nothing by reading people accurately and acting on what he saw. He told me once in the library, sitting in one of those green armchairs, Lindsay, the loudest people in a room are always the ones most afraid of what the quiet people might be thinking. I didn't know then that he was already planning. I didn't know that 8 months before that Thanksgiving, Edward had called his estate attorney. Not the family's shared attorney, a different one. A firm in Midtown he had used privately since 1987, and had begun a process so quiet, so methodical, so completely invisible to everyone around him that by the time anyone thought to look, it was already done. I didn't know any of it yet. I just knew that when I left that Thanksgiving dinner, coat in hand, glass left on the coaster, I sat in my car in the driveway for 4 minutes before I started the engine. I looked at the lights in the front windows. I could hear, faintly, the sound of my mother laughing at something. I drove back to Brooklyn, and I did not cry until I was inside my apartment with the door locked behind me. My phone buzzed at 11:47 that night. A text from a number I didn't recognize. No, wait, I recognized it. I had just never seen it send a text before. It was my grandfather's number. Edward Hughes, who did not text, who had once described his phone as a device I carry to make other people feel better about being able to reach me, had sent me 3 words. Come Monday. Alone, I want to go back to that Thanksgiving because I skimmed over it in the hook, and you deserve to understand what actually happened. Not the outline of it, the texture of it, the specific, particular way a family can dismantle a person in the middle of a holiday meal and then pass the cranberry sauce like nothing occurred. We arrived at the Hamptons house at noon. I say we, loosely. I drove out alone, as I always did, while my parents and Brooke came together in my father's car from their house in Greenwich. I had considered not coming at all. I had stood in my Brooklyn apartment that Wednesday morning, with my keys in my hand, and genuinely debated turning around, calling in a headache, sending a nice text. I came anyway. I always came anyway. That was the part of me I had not yet learned to protect. The house looked the way it always looked in November. The hydrangeas cut back to stubs, the boathouse shuttered, the lawn that particular shade of gray-green that coastal grass turns when the season has decided it's finished. I parked in the side lot and sat in the car for a moment. The water was visible through the tree line, flat and pewter-colored, cold and very still. Edward was on the porch when I came around the side of the house. He was wearing a navy cardigan and holding a mug of something, looking at the water the way he always did. Not like he was thinking about it, more like he was just letting it exist in front of him. He saw me coming and raised the mug slightly. His version of a wave. You look tired, he said. Long drive, I said. He looked at me for a moment, that particular Edward Hughes look, the one that saw more than it let on. And then he nodded once and held the door open. Inside, my mother had already claimed the kitchen. This was her annual performance, the Thanksgiving kitchen takeover, executed with the focused intensity of someone who needed to be visibly necessary at all times. She had brought her own roasting pan, her own spice rack, her own playlist of instrumental music, that she said helped her cook, but that I suspected was mainly to prevent conversation. She kissed me on the cheek when I came in and immediately turned back to the stove. Brooke was in the living room with two of my father's cousins, showing them something on her phone. She was wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater, and her hair was blown out, and she looked exactly like what she had always been trained to look like. The daughter who turned out right. She glanced up when I came in, a small smile. The kind that doesn't involve the eyes, Lindsay, she said. You made it. as though my presence was a pleasant surprise rather than a prior commitment. My father's cousins, Gerald and his wife Patricia, said hello warmly enough. I liked Gerald. He was the only other person in the extended family who seemed vaguely aware that the dynamics in the Hughes household were not entirely normal. He poured me a glass of sparkling water without being asked, and asked about my work, and listened when I answered. There were 11 people in the house by 1 o'clock. 14 by 2, the dinner itself was fine. For a while, Edward sat at the head of the table as always. He ate slowly and listened to conversations more than he participated in them. My father sat to his left, Richard in his element, telling a story about a colleague's failed real estate venture with the barely concealed satisfaction of a man who has never missed an opportunity to be superior. Brooke sat to Edward's right and refilled his water glass twice without being asked. I sat at the far end of the table next to Gerald's wife Patricia, which was where I always sat, and I ate my turkey. And I listened, and I was, I think, largely invisible, which was more or less the arrangement everyone preferred. Then my mother went to get the album. I did not know it was coming. That is important to understand. This was not something I had been warned about or could have steeled myself for. One moment, my mother was in the kitchen retrieving what I assumed was dessert, and the next, she was standing at the entrance to the dining room, holding a large, cream-colored photo album with a linen cover, the kind that costs several $100s, and is designed to look like an heirloom before it's even filled. I have something for the table, she said. She set it down in the center, near Edward, and opened it to the first page. It was a photograph from Christmas 2019. The whole family in front of the fireplace in this very room. My father, my mother, Brooke, Edward and Margaret's framed portrait on the mantel behind them. A golden, perfect, magazine-worthy family Christmas. I was not in it. I remembered that Christmas. I had been standing 6 feet to the left of where that photograph was taken. I had been holding a glass of eggnog. I could recall the specific pattern of the rug under my feet. I was not in the photograph. My mother turned the page. Easter 2021. Brooke and my father in the garden, holding a basket, laughing at something off camera. Beautiful. Warm. I was not in it. She kept turning. 4th of July. A birthday dinner for Edward. New Year's Eve 2022. A summer afternoon on the boathouse dock. 43 photographs. I counted them later from memory, sitting in my car. In some of them I recognized moments I had been physically present for. The birthday dinner, I had baked the cake. The 4th of July. I had driven 3 hours to be there, not one image. Not one frame. I sat very still and looked at each page as my mother turned them, and I kept my face in a neutral position the way I had learned to do over many years of practice. Gerald caught my eye once, briefly, and then looked away. His wife, Patricia, had stopped eating. Edward said nothing. He looked at the album with an expression I could not read. My father waited until the last page was turned. Then he picked up his wine glass, cleared his throat in that particular way he had. That announced he was about to say something he had prepared, and he spoke loud enough for the entire table to hear. "This is our family," he said. "This is what it looks like. This is who we are and what we're passing on. Brooke, your grandfather and I have talked, and we want you to know that when the time comes, everything, this house, the accounts, all of it, it stays with you. With the family," he paused. "The real family." He still did not look at me. He did not need to. Everyone else did. I felt 14 pairs of eyes make the calculation simultaneously. The glance to my father, the glance to me, the quick assessment of what was happening, and whether anyone was going to say anything about it. Gerald opened his mouth. I looked at him and gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. I picked up my napkin, set it beside my plate, pushed back my chair, slowly, without scraping, and stood up. I walked to the hallway, retrieved my coat from the rack by the door. I did not rush. I did not slam anything. I did not give my father the satisfaction of a reaction he could point to later and say, "See, this is why." Edward was watching me from the table. I could feel it. I got to the door and I put my hand on the handle and I turned back once. Not to the table, not to my parents, just to my grandfather. He was looking at me with that expression again. The one I could not read, but his chin dipped, slightly. Deliberately later, I would understand that it was not a gesture of apology. It was a gesture of patience. "Wait," it said. "I have it handled." I walked out into the November cold, got into my car, and sat in the driveway for 4 minutes. The lights inside were warm and golden. I could hear, faintly, my mother's voice resuming some other conversation. I started the engine. I drove back to Brooklyn. And at 11:47 that night, Edward Hughes, who did not text, sent me 3 words on my phone: come Monday. Alone, I did not sleep well that weekend, not because I was devastated. I want to be precise about that. The Thanksgiving dinner had hurt, the way a bruise hurts when you press on it, a pain that was familiar enough to be almost unremarkable. What kept me awake was the text. 3 words from a man who communicated exclusively by phone call and handwritten note, sent at nearly midnight on a holiday, with no explanation and no follow-up. I read it 17 times between Thursday night and Sunday morning. I changed nothing about my interpretation of it. I simply could not stop reading it. Come Monday. Alone, I texted back Friday morning. I'll be there. 10 o'clock? He replied 4 hours later with a single word: fine. That was the entire conversation. I spent the weekend doing what I always did when I needed to think without thinking. I worked. I had a project on the boards, a brownstone renovation in Carroll Gardens, for a couple who had bought a wreck and wanted it turned into something worth keeping. I spread the drawings across my dining table, and I worked on the kitchen layout, and I drank too much coffee, and I let the weekend pass around me, while my mind ran its quiet background calculations about what Monday might mean. The honest answer was that I didn't know. Edward had asked me to come alone before, twice, in recent years, once to help him sort through Margaret's remaining belongings in the cottage, once to look at some water damage in the library ceiling. Those visits had been practical, direct. This felt different in a way I couldn't name precisely. The timing of it, the hour of the text, the fact that he had watched me leave that dinner and said nothing to anyone and then, 3 hours later, sent that message. I kept coming back to his face at the table. That expression. Saturday afternoon, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Brooke? I let it ring. She called again Sunday morning. Then my mother called. Then a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be my father calling from his office line, which he did sometimes when he suspected I might be screening him. I let all of it go to voicemail. I did not listen to any of the messages. I already knew the shape of what they would contain. Some version of an explanation that was not an apology, some carefully constructed narrative in which what happened at Thanksgiving was either a misunderstanding or, worse, my fault for taking it the wrong way. I had been taking things the wrong way my entire life. According to my family, I drove out to East Hampton on Monday morning. The expressway was empty the way it only gets after a holiday weekend, everyone already back in the city, the whole Long Island Expressway exhaling. I got to the house at 5 minutes past 10. The driveway had 2 cars in it, Edward's old Volvo and a dark blue sedan I didn't recognize, New York plates, a parking permit from a midtown garage hanging from the rearview mirror. I sat in my car and looked at that sedan for a long moment. Then I got out and went to the door. Edward answered before I knocked. He had been watching from the front window. I caught the curtain movement. He looked rested, which surprised me. He was wearing his good cardigan, the charcoal one he saved for meetings, and he was carrying a folder, not a casual folder, the kind with a firm spine and a legal firm's logo embossed in the corner. Come in, he said. There's someone I want you to meet. The man in the library was about 60, with silver hair cut short and the particular stillness of someone who spent their professional life in rooms where people said consequential things. He stood when I entered and extended his hand. Miss Hughes, he said, I'm Warren Delacroix. I've been your grandfather's private estate attorney since 1987. Private. I caught that word and set it aside to examine later. Warren is here because I asked him to be, Edward said, settling into one of the green armchairs, the ones I had reupholstered 6 years ago now, and because there are things you need to know, and I want a witness when I tell you. I sat down in the chair across from him. Warren Delacroix took a seat to the side, slightly back. The posture of a man who understood his role in this particular moment was to observe and verify rather than to speak. I owe you an explanation, Edward said. You don't owe me anything, I said. I do. He said it with the quiet firmness that meant the subject was closed. Not for Thursday. I knew what Thursday was going to look like before it happened. I let it happen because I needed to see something confirmed. He paused. I needed to see how you would leave. I looked at him. How I would leave. You picked up your coat. You didn't slam the door. You looked at me on your way out. He nodded slowly. That told me everything I needed to know. I didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. But something in my chest had gone very still. He opened the folder on his knee. He did not hand it to me immediately. He looked at it for a moment, the way people look at things they have thought about for a long time. Your father believes, he said, that he knows exactly how my estate is structured. He believes this because I allowed him to believe it. Over the past 12 years, Richard has made a number of assumptions about what he was entitled to, and I have never corrected those assumptions because it was useful to me that he held them. He paused. Outside the library window, a gull went past, angling toward the water. Useful, I repeated. People who believe they have already won, Edward said, stop paying attention to what you're actually doing. Warren Delacroix shifted slightly in his chair, not from discomfort, from recognition. The look of a man who had heard his client say this before and believed it to be true. I've been watching your father manage my proximity for 30 years, Edward said. I've watched your mother organize my life in ways that made it very easy for them to know exactly what I was doing at all times. I've watched Brooke perform devotion with the consistency of someone who has been coached, which she has been. He said all of this without anger, just clarity, the tone of a man taking inventory. And I've watched you come into this library and argue with me about cantilever beams and refuse to pretend you found my jokes funnier than they were. And I decided, some years ago, that you were the only person in this family I actually trusted. The room was very quiet, Grandpa, I said. My voice came out smaller than I intended. I'm not telling you this for sentiment, he said, not unkindly. I'm telling you, because what I'm about to show you is going to require you to be steady, and I need to know before I hand you this folder that you understand. It is not a gift given lightly. It is the result of 7 years of careful, deliberate, completely legal work that Warren and I have undertaken together. And it is, as of 4 months ago, irrevocable. He held out the folder. I took it. The first page had my name at the top, Lindsay Marie Hughes, sole primary beneficiary. Below it, a number. I read it twice. $4,200,000 in trust accounts, plus the property. All of it. Every acre of the East Hampton estate, the boathouse, the cottage, the garden Margaret had planted by hand. My father's name appeared nowhere in the document, neither did Brooke's. I sat with that folder in my hands in the library, where I had spent some of the best hours of my life, and I looked at my grandfather, and I did not know what to say, which almost never happens to me. Why are you telling me now? I finally asked. After Thursday? Edward was quiet for a moment, because Thursday was the last thing they had to do to you, he said. And now it's done. And now we can finish this. He looked at Warren Delacroix. Warren nodded once. I looked back at my grandfather. At the cardigan, at the folder in my hands. At the mug on the side table that smelled like the same coffee this kitchen had always smelled like. There's something else, Edward said. Something Warren needs to walk you through. About the house specifically, he leaned forward slightly. Lindsay, he said. The house has been in your name for 14 months. Warren Delacroix set a second folder on the side table between us. This one was thicker than the first. Tabbed, color-coded, the kind of organization that speaks to years of careful maintenance rather than recent assembly. He opened it to the first divider and turned it so I could read the page facing me. He did not explain it immediately. He gave me 30 seconds to read it myself, which told me he was good at his job. It was a property transfer document, dated 14 months ago. Transferring full ownership of the East Hampton estate, the main house, the cottage, the boathouse, the 4.5 acres, the dock rights, all of it, into a revocable living trust. The trust's sole beneficiary, listed on the second line in clean black type, was Lindsay Marie Hughes. I read it twice. Then a third time. The transfer was executed 14 months ago, Warren said. It was recorded with Suffolk County the following week. It is a matter of public record, though not one your father has ever thought to check, because it did not occur to him that there was anything to check. He said this without editorial, just fact, delivered with the precision of a man who had arranged it that way, intentionally. He thinks the house is still in your name, I said to Edward. He thinks the house is still in my name, Edward confirmed. He has thought this for 14 months. He has, in that time, had 3 separate conversations with me about his plans for the property after I'm gone. He mentioned a developer he'd been speaking with in the Hamptons. Mentioned a figure. Edward's expression did not change. I listened very politely. Something cold and clarifying moved through me. Not anger, exactly. Something more structural than anger. The feeling of a thing coming into focus that had been blurry for a very long time. Walk me through all of it, I said to Warren. From the beginning. Warren nodded. He was the kind of attorney who did not need to be asked twice. It had started, he explained, 7 years ago. Edward had come to his midtown office on a Tuesday in February, unannounced, which Warren said was characteristic, and had sat down and said he wanted to restructure his estate entirely. Not update it, restructure it, from the foundation. The existing will at that point divided the estate in thirds among Richard, a charitable foundation Edward had established in Margaret's name, and a small bequest to Brooke for educational purposes. There was nothing for me. I had not known this. I want to say that plainly, because it matters. I had never expected anything from Edward's estate, had never thought about it, had never positioned myself around it the way my father had spent decades doing. The first time I heard about the existing will's structure was in that library from Warren Delacroix on a Monday morning in November, and my primary feeling upon hearing it was not hurt, but a kind of grim recognition. Of course. That was what the heir in that family had always been moving toward. But 7 years ago, Edward had changed his mind. He had watched something that year that decided it for him. Warren did not know the specific incident. Edward had not told him, and Warren understood that some information was not his to have. But Edward had come in that February and said he wanted to start moving assets, quietly and legally, in a new direction. He had been specific. He wanted the process to be invisible to his son's family for as long as possible. He wanted every transfer to be legitimate, documented, and unassailable. And he wanted Lindsay Hughes to receive everything. Warren had spent 6 months reviewing the most legally sound approach. The result was a three-phase strategy. Phase 1. Establish a separate revocable living trust in Lindsay's name, funded initially with liquid assets, 3 brokerage accounts totaling just over $1.1 million, moved across 18 months in increments small enough not to trigger the kind of financial conversation Richard would notice. Edward had continued to maintain a primary account that Richard occasionally had visibility into. Enough activity, enough balance, to confirm the assumption that nothing unusual was happening. The 3 accounts that moved were ones Richard had never known existed. Edward had opened them in the early 90s, before Richard had developed his habit of useful proximity. Phase 2. Transfer the East Hampton property into the trust. This was the most significant move and the one that required the most care. Warren had structured it as a standard intra-family trust transfer, the kind used routinely in estate planning, unremarkable on its face, recorded publicly but not announced. The deed changed hands 14 months ago, on a Wednesday afternoon. Edward had signed the paperwork in Warren's office, and then driven back to East Hampton and made himself a sandwich, and, as far as Warren could tell, gone back to reading his book, Phase 3. The will itself. Revised 8 months ago, witnessed by Warren and a paralegal with no connection to the Hughes family, notarized and filed. It was not the primary mechanism of transfer. Most of the assets had already moved through the trust. But it served as confirmation and covered any remaining personal property, the contents of the house, Margaret's jewelry, the library's collection of first editions that Edward valued more than most people understood. My father's name appeared in the will exactly once, in a clause that bequeathed him a specific item. The leather briefcase he had admired at Christmas 3 years ago and mentioned twice since. Just the briefcase. I looked up from the folder. He's going to try to contest it, I said. He is going to try, Warren agreed. We anticipated this. Your grandfather's mental competency has been evaluated and documented by 3 independent neurologists over the past 4 years, including one evaluation conducted 6 weeks ago. The most recent report is in the 3rd tab. Each evaluation concluded that Edward is fully cognitively intact, with no indicators of diminished capacity, undue influence, or impaired judgment. Warren allowed a brief pause. The documentation is, I would say, unusually thorough. I asked for thorough. Edward said from his chair. You asked for thorough, Warren confirmed, with the faint expression of a man who had delivered thorough. I sat back. Outside the window the garden was bare, the hydrangea stubs casting thin shadows on the frost-whitened grass. Margaret's garden. My grandfather had maintained it for 20 years after she died, hiring the same groundskeeper every spring, keeping every plant she had chosen. He had never changed a single thing about it. There's something I need to ask you. I said to Edward, ask. The people at Thanksgiving, Gerald. Patricia. The cousins, I paused. Did you know what was going to happen? Before it happened? He was quiet for a moment. Your father told me 2 weeks prior that he intended to make an announcement at Thanksgiving, Edward said. He framed it as a family unity matter. He said he wanted everyone to understand the plan for the estate going forward, and he felt a family gathering was the appropriate setting. A pause. I did not tell him I disagreed. You let him do it in front of everyone. I let him do it in front of everyone, Edward said, because I needed witnesses to what your family considers acceptable behavior. Because when the time comes, and your father attempts to claim that I was manipulated or deceived, there will be 11 people who can testify to what he said at that table, in that room. In front of your grandfather, 3 weeks before my death was presumably meant to make it all legal. He looked at me steadily. Your father made a record of himself, Lindsay. I simply made sure he had an audience when he did it. The room was very still. I thought about my father's voice, the real family, the way he had not looked at me when he said it. The album with 43 photographs and not one of my face. I thought about walking to the door, picking up my coat slowly, turning back to look at Edward, his chin dipping, just once. Wait, there's one more thing, Warren said. He reached into the folder and produced a single page, separate from the rest, printed on plain white paper rather than legal letterhead. He handed it to me. It was a letter, handwritten. Edward's handwriting. I knew it from birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes he left on library books he thought I should read. Lindsay, it began. By the time you read this in its proper context, you will already know most of what I have done and why. What I want you to know, which Warren cannot put in a legal document, is this. I did not do this because I pitied you. I did it because you are the only person in this family who ever sat across from me and told me the truth when I was wrong. That is rarer than $4 million. That is rarer than 4.5 acres in East Hampton. Take care of the garden. Margaret would have wanted you to have it. I folded the letter, set it on my knee. I did not cry. Not there, not in front of Warren Delacroix. Not while my grandfather was sitting 4 feet away in the green armchair, watching me with that patient, accurate expression of his. I cried later, in the car, pulled over on Montauk Highway, with the hazards on and the heater running. I cried for a long time, but in the library, I kept my hands steady and looked at my grandfather and said the only thing that felt true enough to say out loud. I'll take care of the garden, Isis. He nodded. I know you will, he said. What neither of us said, what we did not need to say, because it was already done and signed and filed and irrevocable, was what was coming next. My father was about to find out that the thing he had spent 30 years positioning himself to inherit did not belong to him. It had not belonged to him for 14 months. And the man he had underestimated for all of those 30 years had made absolutely certain he could not do a single thing about it. I did not tell anyone what I knew. This was harder than it sounds. I want to be honest about that, because there is a version of this story where I float through the next several weeks, feeling quietly superior, secure in my knowledge, untouchable. That is not what it felt like. What it felt like was carrying something very heavy in a very small space, alone, while the people around me continued to behave as though the world was arranged the way they believed it to be. I went back to Brooklyn that Monday afternoon, and I put Warren Delacroix's card in the inside pocket of my winter coat, and I placed the folder, copies of everything. Warren had insisted, in the locked filing cabinet under my drafting table, where I kept original client contracts and my passport and the deed to my grandmother's pearl earrings, which Margaret had left me directly in a separate letter 8 years before she died. Then I went back to the Carroll Gardens brownstone drawings. And I worked until 11 o'clock, and I did not think about Thanksgiving or the album, or my father's voice saying real family over a table of people who would remember it. I thought about those things later. But not that night. Edward died on a Thursday morning in late January. He had gone to bed the night before, after finishing a chapter of the Patrick O'Brien novel he'd been working through since October. His housekeeper, a woman named Gloria, who had worked for him for 19 years, found him at 7:15. He had not suffered. The cardiologist had been telling him for 2 years that his heart was operating on a schedule of its own choosing, and apparently it had chosen a Wednesday night in January, quietly, in his own bed, in the house he had lived in for 50 years. Gloria called me before she called my father. I did not ask her to do that. I found out later that Edward had left her a note in the kitchen, in an envelope with my name on the outside. The note said, "Call Lindsay first, then Richard. Give her 10 minutes." Gloria gave me 11. I was on the expressway by 8:15. I called Warren Delacroix from the car. He answered on the second ring, which told me he had been expecting the call. He said he was sorry about Edward. He meant it. I could hear it, the specific register of genuine grief mixed with professional composure. He said the formal reading of the will was already scheduled for the following Friday at his Midtown office, per Edward's prior instructions. He said I did not need to do anything except show up. He also said carefully, Your father is going to receive a letter this week, informing him of the date and time. He will receive no other information prior to the reading. That is standard practice, and it is also, in this case, intentional. He's going to think he already knows what's in it, I said. Yes, Warren said. He is. I drove the rest of the way in silence. The house looked different without Edward in it, which I had not expected to feel so immediately. It was the same house. Same gray-green lawn, same boathouse, same bare hydrangeas, but it had a quality that I can only describe as unoccupied in a way that had nothing to do with whether people were physically inside it. Gloria let me in and hugged me for a long moment without saying anything, which was exactly right. I spent 2 hours there that morning before my parents arrived. My father's car pulled into the driveway at 10:40. I watched from the library window. He got out first, then my mother, then Brooke, who was wearing sunglasses despite the flat January overcast. They came inside, and there was the machinery of family grief. Embraces, lowered voices, my mother going immediately to the kitchen. My father put his hand briefly on my shoulder when he passed me in the hallway, which was more physical acknowledgement than I had received from him in approximately 3 years, and said, "Glad you're here." He did not make eye contact. Brooke found me in the library 20 minutes later. She stood in the doorway with a mug of coffee. She had made herself at home in Edward's kitchen with impressive speed, and looked around the room with the particular expression of someone doing an inventory they don't want to appear to be doing. "It's strange being here without him," she said. "Yes," I said. She came in and sat in one of the green armchairs. My armchairs, technically, though I had not yet begun to think in those terms. She looked at the bookshelves, at the reading nook, at the desk where Edward had signed, among other things, a document transferring 4.5 acres of East Hampton real estate into my name 14 months ago. "I've been thinking," Brooke said, turning the mug in her hands, "that we should probably get an appraiser out here soon. For the house. Just to have a number," she said it casually, as though the thought had just occurred to her, as though she had not clearly rehearsed the phrasing. "Dad has a developer contact in Southampton who's done some comps in the area. Could be useful to know what we're working with." I looked at her. "The estate attorney handles all of that," I said. "There's a reading scheduled next Friday." "Right, of course." She nodded, took a sip of coffee. "Do you know anything about the will? Like, did Grandpa ever mention anything to you about?" "The attorney handles all of that," I said again. She looked at me over the rim of the mug. Something shifted in her expression, a small recalibration. She had expected me to either not know or not matter, and she was trying to determine, without asking directly, which it was. I gave her nothing. That evening my father called me into Edward's study. He sat behind the desk, Edward's desk, with the ease of a man who had been waiting to sit there for a long time. My mother stood near the window. Brooke leaned against the bookcase. It had the feeling of a meeting that had been arranged before I arrived. "We wanted to talk to you before the reading next week," my father said. "All right," I said. He folded his hands on the desk. "I know things have been tense between us, and I think your grandfather's passing is a good opportunity for us to realign. As a family," he paused, letting the word family do its work. "There are going to be decisions to make about the estate, practical decisions, and it would be easier for everyone if we were approaching those decisions together." "Together," I said. "United front, you know?" He smiled briefly, the smile of a man extending an olive branch he did not actually possess. "Obviously, the estate goes to the family. Dad always intended for it to stay in the family. The house, the accounts, it all stays together. Brooke and I have been talking with a developer who's very interested in the property, and the number he's quoting is—" "Dad," I said. He stopped. "The estate attorney handles all of that," I said. "There's a reading scheduled next Friday." The silence in the room was a different quality of silence than the was before it. My father's hands unfolded on the desk. My mother turned slightly from the window. Brooke had gone very still against the bookcase. My father looked at me for a long moment. "Lindsay," he said, and his voice had dropped into the register he used when he wanted to remind me of something I was supposed to already understand. "I'm asking you, as your father, to be part of this conversation, to be cooperative, to act like a member of this family." I thought about the album. 43 photographs. I thought about Warren Delacroix's folder, locked in my filing cabinet in Brooklyn. About the property transfer recorded with Suffolk County 14 months ago. About a letter in my grandfather's handwriting, well, I was the only person in his family who had ever told him the truth. I thought about how my father was currently sitting behind a desk in a house that belonged to me. "I'll see you at the reading," I said. I picked up my coat from the chair by the door. I left the study in the same way I had left the Thanksgiving table, slowly, without slamming anything, without giving him a reaction he could use. Behind me, I heard my mother say something low and sharp to my father. I heard my father's chair push back. I heard Brooke say, "Let her go. She doesn't know anything." I walked to my car. I sat in the driveway for a moment. The garden was dark. The hydrangeas, cut to stubs, cast no shadows. My phone rang 4 minutes after I started the engine. My father, calling from the office line. I let it ring. 3 seconds after it stopped, a text arrived from a number I didn't recognize. I glanced at it at a red light 2 miles down the road. It was a document, a single page, photographed on what looked like Edward's desk. At the top, in large formal type, "Power of attorney, irrevocable." Below it, my grandfather's name, and below that, a signature line, blank, with my father's name typed underneath it. The document was dated 6 years ago, but the signature on the line was not 6 years old. I pulled over. I looked at the photograph for a long time, then I called Warren Delacroix. He answered on the first ring. "I think," I said, "that my father just made a very serious mistake." Warren told me not to respond to the text. He said it calmly, the way he said most things, with the focused economy of someone who understood that in certain situations, the wrong word at the wrong moment could cost significantly more than silence. He asked me to forward the photograph to his secure email immediately, which I did, pulled over on a dark road 2 miles from the East Hampton house, with my hazards blinking and the heat running. He said he would have it reviewed by morning. He said I should go home, sleep if I could, and not speak to my father or anyone in my father's household about anything related to the estate until after the Friday reading. "Is it real?" I asked. "The document." A pause. "The signature is not consistent with your grandfather's signature on file with my office," Warren said. "I can see that from here. But I want a forensic examiner to confirm it before we discuss next steps." "My father forged it," I said. "It was not a question. I want a forensic examiner to confirm it," Warren said again, gently. I drove back to Brooklyn. I did not sleep well. What I did instead of sleeping was think about the timeline. The power of attorney document in that photograph was dated 6 years ago. Which meant, if it was genuine, my father had been holding it for 6 years and had never mentioned it to Warren, never filed it with any financial institution, never used it in any of the dozens of conversations he had conducted with Edward's various service providers over the years. No legitimate power of attorney sits unused for 6 years while the grantor remains fully competent and active. It sits unused for 6 years when the person holding it is waiting for a specific moment to deploy it, or when it was made after the fact. I thought about my father sitting behind Edward's desk. The ease of it. The way he had folded his hands like a man settling into something that was already his. I thought about the developer in Southampton. The number he was quoting. I thought about my sister saying she doesn't know anything. Her voice carrying through the study door with the confidence of someone who has never once in her life considered that the room might be listening. By Wednesday morning, Warren had his confirmation. He called me at 8:15. The forensic document examiner, a firm he had used for 23 years, he said, with a track record in estate litigation, had identified multiple inconsistencies in the signature on the power of attorney. Ink oxidation inconsistent with a 6-year-old document, pressure patterns inconsistent with Edward's no-signing style across 11 authenticated documents, and one detail the examiner flagged specifically. A microscopic fiber trace on the paper, consistent with a type of printer paper that had not been commercially available until 4 years after the document's stated date. My father had not just forged a signature. He had forged it on paper that did not exist when the document claimed to have been signed. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now," Warren said, "we let Friday happen, and we bring the examiner's report with us." I said nothing for a moment. "Warren," I said, "did my father actually try to file this document anywhere? Use it for anything?" Another pause, slightly longer this time. "We are still confirming," he said carefully, "but there is preliminary indication that someone attempted to contact Edward's primary financial institution last week, using a power of attorney document as authorization. The institution flagged it and did not process the request, per standard protocol when an account holder's death has been recently reported. The flag is in the file." He paused again. "The account in question held approximately $214,000. The number sat in the air between us. He tried to access the account before the reading, I said. There is preliminary indication, Warren said, of an attempt. Yes, I sat down on the edge of my bed. Outside my Brooklyn window, a city bus went past. Ordinary Tuesday morning. Somewhere across the East River, my father was probably eating breakfast and reading the financial section and believing, with the comfortable certainty of a man who had never seriously been challenged, that everything was proceeding according to his plan. Okay, I said. Friday. What I did not do in the days between the phone call and the Friday reading was react. This required more discipline than I would like to admit. My phone collected messages the way a drain collects water, slow at first, then faster, then a volume that suggested a certain mounting anxiety on the other end. My father called 4 times Wednesday, twice Thursday. My mother called 3 times Wednesday and left one voicemail that I listened to once, standing in my kitchen, and then deleted. The voicemail was 14 minutes long. In it, she said the word family 11 times. She said the word reasonable 6 times. She said or get found out I would have wanted twice, which was the most revealing thing she could possibly have said, because what it told me was that she had already begun constructing the narrative she intended to use. The one in which Edward's wishes and Richard's assumptions were the same thing, and any document suggesting otherwise was a deviation from the true intention rather than the expression of it. Brooke texted me Thursday afternoon, Lindsay, can we talk? I think there's been a misunderstanding about what happened at Thanksgiving, and I want to clear the air before Friday. I put my phone face down on the drafting table and went back to the Carroll Gardens drawings. What I did instead of reacting was prepare. I met with Warren Thursday morning for 90 minutes in his Midtown office, a place that smelled like old wood and paper and the particular quiet that expensive square footage in Manhattan produces. We went through the reading procedure, the documentation sequence, the forensic report. Warren walked me through the exact order in which things would be revealed and why the order mattered. He had done this before. Not this exact situation, but the shape of it, the specific geometry of a family who believed they were walking into a confirmation and discovered they were walking into something else entirely. He said the most important thing I could do was remain physically still and verbally quiet for as long as possible after the documents were read. People will look at you, he said, when the numbers are read. When the names are read, everyone in that room is going to turn and look at you. What they see on your face in that moment will become the story they tell about this day. What do you want them to see? I asked. He considered this. Calm, he said. Just calm. I spent Thursday evening doing the one thing that had always steadied me. I worked on the Carroll Gardens project. I finished the kitchen layout. I resolved a problem with the rear staircase that had been nagging at me for 2 weeks. A load-bearing wall I needed to route around that turned out to have a simple solution I had been overcomplicating. I made tea. I went to bed at 10:30. I slept, surprisingly, very well. Friday morning I dressed carefully. Not dramatically, I was not trying to make a statement with what I wore, but carefully. Dark trousers, a good silk blouse and a deep burgundy, my winter coat, the pearl earrings Margaret had left me. I looked in the mirror before I left, and I thought about what Warren had said. Just calm. I took the subway to Midtown. Warren's office was on the 41st floor of a building on Park Avenue, with a reception area done in the kind of understated gray and walnut that communicated seriousness without effort. The receptionist offered me coffee. I accepted. I sat in a chair by the window and looked out at the city and drank my coffee and waited. My father arrived at 9:52, 8 minutes before the scheduled start time. He came in with my mother on one side, and Brooke on the other, and a man I did not recognize, 50s, sharp suit, the slightly aggressive energy of a hired attorney who has been briefed to expect a negotiation. My father saw me sitting by the window, and his expression did something complicated. A flicker of surprise, quickly smoothed. He had not expected me to be calm. He had probably expected red eyes and defensive posture, the body language of someone who knew they were outmatched. He nodded at me, I nodded back. My mother did not look at me. Brooke looked at me and then looked away. The hired attorney. I learned later his name was Feldman, from a firm in White Plains. Scanned the room with the practiced efficiency of someone assessing terrain. His eyes landed on Warren, and they exchanged the brief, mutual recognition of two professionals who understood exactly what kind of morning this was going to be. Warren's paralegal, a young woman named Shay, set 5 copies of a bound document on the conference table. One for each of us, one for the record. We sat down. Warren opened his copy. cleared his throat once. "Thank you all for being here," he said. "We're here today for the formal reading of the last will and testament of Edward Charles Hughes, executed 8 months ago and witnessed in accordance with New York State estate law. Before I begin, I want to note for the record that this reading will also address certain ancillary matters pertaining to trust transfers previously executed by Mr. Hughes and a separate evidentiary matter that has come to my attention this week." He paused. "Mr. Feldman, I assume you are here representing Richard Hughes." Feldman said yes. "You'll want to pay particular attention," Warren said pleasantly, "to the second section." My father leaned forward slightly. Warren began to read. I kept my hands flat on the table in front of me, and I looked at the window and I breathed steadily, and I thought about a garden in East Hampton, bare in winter, waiting for spring. My father's name appeared for the first time on page 7, one line. "To my son Richard Charles Hughes, I bequeath the leather briefcase currently stored in the upper left closet of the main house study, being the item he has admired on multiple occasions and which I hope will serve him well." The room went completely silent. My father read the line, read it again, looked up at Warren, and that was when Warren turned to page 9 and began to read my name. My name appeared 14 times in that document. I had known this. Warren had told me. I had read the will myself, sitting in the library in East Hampton with the folder on my knee, and my grandfather 4 feet away in the green armchair. I knew every line, every clause, every figure. There was nothing in that conference room on the 41st floor of a Park Avenue building that should have surprised me, and yet, hearing it read aloud, Warren's voice, measured and precise, filling the room with the specific weight of legal language, felt different from reading it privately. It felt, in a way I had not anticipated, like being seen. After 32 years of being edited out of the frame, of being the person not in the photograph, of being the name not on the list, hearing my name read, again and again, into a room full of people who had arranged their entire understanding of the world around my absence from it, was something I had not prepared myself for emotionally, even when I had prepared for everything else. I kept my hands flat on the table. I looked at the window. I breathed. Warren read the trust provisions first. The 3 brokerage accounts, totaling just over $1.1 million, transferred across 18 months in increments, now consolidated under my name. He read the account numbers. He read the transfer dates. He read the balances as of the previous business day. Feldman, my father's attorney, was writing very fast. My mother had gone still in the way that bodies go so still when the brain is working too hard to allocate resources to movement. She was staring at the bound document in front of her, at a page she had turned to perhaps 30 seconds after Warren began reading, and she had not turned another page since. Brooke was looking at me. I did not look back at her. Not yet. Warren moved to the property section. He read the trust transfer document, the one dated 14 months ago, recorded with Suffolk County, transferring the East Hampton estate in its entirety into the trust of which I was sole beneficiary. He read the address. He read the acreage. He read the appraised value, which had been assessed 8 months ago at $6,800,000. My father made a sound. It was not a word. It was something that started as a word and didn't complete itself. A compressed, involuntary sound, the kind a person makes when something hits them before they have time to form a response. He looked at Warren. His face had done the thing faces do when blood redirects. A sudden pallor under the winter tan, a tightening around the jaw. "That's," he started. "I'll ask everyone to hold questions until the reading is complete," Warren said, without looking up. "Thank you, Richard." Feldman put his hand briefly on my father's arm. My father sat back. He picked up his copy of the document and looked at the property transfer section himself, line by line, as though looking at it hard enough might change what it said. Warren continued, "The personal property provisions. The library's first edition collection, appraised at $240,000, transferred to me. Margaret's remaining jewelry, the contents of the main house, the boathouse equipment, the cottage furnishings, item by item, methodical and complete." Warren read the inventory of a life my grandfather had built over 81 years and had chosen, with full legal clarity and documented cognitive competency, to leave to one person. By the time Warren reached the charitable bequest to Margaret's foundation, a clean $500,000, the one provision that was not directed to me. Brooke had stopped looking at me and was looking at the table instead. Her coffee cup was in front of her, untouched and cold. My mother had not moved. Warren read the briefcase bequest, one line. One item. I heard my father exhale through his nose. Then Warren set down the will and picked up a second document, and the temperature in the room changed again. I want to address the ancillary matter I referenced at the opening of this reading, he said. He did not look at my father when he said it. He looked at the document. On Monday of this week, I received a photograph forwarded to me by Ms. Lindsay Hughes. The photograph depicted a document purporting to be an irrevocable power of attorney executed by Edward Charles Hughes 6 years ago, authorizing Richard Charles Hughes to act as agent over certain financial matters. Feldman stopped writing. I engaged a forensic document examiner. On Tuesday morning, Warren continued, the examination was completed Wednesday. The examiner's report, which I have here in full and which has been filed with my office records, identifies the following. He turned a page. First, ink oxidation inconsistent with a document of the stated age, indicating the document was produced significantly more recently than its stated date. Second, signature pressure patterns inconsistent with Mr. Hughes's authenticated signing profile across 11 verified documents on file with this office. Third, paper fiber composition consistent with a commercially available paper stock that was not introduced to market until 4 years after the document's stated execution date. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, 41 floors below, the city moved. A cab changed lanes. Someone walked fast on Park Avenue with their coat open despite the cold. The examiner's conclusion, Warren Finn said, is that the document is not authentic. Feldman set his pen down on the table. Furthermore, Warren said, I have been in contact this week with Mr. Hughes's primary financial institution. I have been informed that on the Wednesday following Mr. Hughes's death, an individual presenting this power of attorney document attempted to authorize a withdrawal from Mr. Hughes's primary checking account. The account held $214,000 at the time of the attempt. The institution flagged the request and did not process it, per their standard protocol following the reported death of an account holder. He looked up. The institution has been cooperative in providing records of the interaction, which have been shared with the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. My father stood up. It was not a controlled movement. It was the movement of a man whose body had decided to act before his mind had finished processing what was happening. His chair scraped back hard against the floor, and he was on his feet, and he was looking at Warren with an expression that had moved past surprise into something rawer and more frightened. That is completely, he started. Richard? Feldman's voice was sharp and low. Sit down. Do not say anything. My father looked at his attorney. Something moved across his face. A reckoning, maybe, with the specific shape of the situation he had walked into. He sat down, slowly. His hands on the table in front of him were not steady. My mother made a small sound beside him. She had both hands pressed flat against the conference table, as though she needed it to stay upright. She was looking at me now, finally, with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, not calculation. Something that looked, stripped of everything else, like fear. Brooke had not moved since Feldman told my father to sit down. She was looking at the bound document, at the page with her name on it, which contained, I knew, because I had read it, exactly nothing. No provision, no bequest, no mention except the omission itself, which in legal terms was the clearest statement of intent available. I thought about her Manhattan apartment. The one that sat on land that was, as of 14 months ago, part of an estate now belonging entirely to me. A detail Warren had mentioned, matter-of-factly, when walking me through the property provisions. The cottage on the East Hampton estate had been leased to Brooke 3 years ago, at a nominal rate, under an informal arrangement with Edward. That arrangement had no standing against the trust transfer. It had ended the moment the deed changed hands. She would need to vacate. I had not decided yet what I would do about that. I was still deciding. Feldman leaned toward my father and spoke quietly, his voice low enough that the words didn't carry. I saw my father nod once, stiffly. Then Feldman straightened and looked at Warren. My client would like to request a recess, Feldman said. The reading is complete, Warren said. A recess is certainly appropriate. I'll note for the record that Miss Hughes has been advised of her rights and obligations under the trust and will provisions, as read today, and that all documentation has been filed with the appropriate county and state offices. Copies of everything have been provided to all parties. He closed the bound document, set it on the table, folded his hands. The Suffolk County DA's office, he said, to no one in particular, will be in contact with the relevant parties directly regarding the ancillary matter. I don't anticipate that will require anything further from this office. My father was staring at the table. I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, the way I had not allowed myself to do in years, because looking directly at the source of a pain you've learned to manage is not always wise. He looked smaller than I expected. Not physically. He was still the same height, still the same broad-shouldered build that had always made him seem like a person who occupied more space than other people. But there was something compressed about him now, something that had been taken out of him by the reading of 14 lines of legal text and the mention of a district attorney's office. And what remained looked tired and old. And for the first time in my memory, genuinely uncertain about what was going to happen next, I thought, you erased me from 43 photographs. I thought, and my grandfather wrote my name 14 times. I did not say either of these things. I picked up my copy of the bound document. I put it in my bag. I stood up and put on my coat carefully, without rushing, and I picked up the coffee cup and took it to the small credenza by the door, because leaving a cup on a conference table had always struck me as a small rudeness I did not need to commit. Warren caught my eye as I turned toward the door. A small nod. The look of a man who had done exactly what he had been asked to do and had done it well. Shay, the paralegal, was already at the door, holding it open. I walked out of the conference room. Behind me, I heard Feldman begin speaking to my father in a low, urgent voice. I heard my mother say something that broke in the middle. I heard Brooke make a sound that was not quite a word. I walked past the reception desk, past the window with the 41st floor view of Park Avenue, past the credenza with the coffee service and the arrangement of white flowers in a tall glass vase. I pushed through the glass door and stepped into the elevator lobby. The elevator came in 11 seconds. I got in. The doors closed, and standing alone in that elevator, descending 41 floors toward a city that was going about its ordinary Friday, I did something I had not let myself do in front of a single person since my grandfather's 3-word text had arrived on a Thursday night in November. I closed my eyes. I breathed. I let myself, for 11 floors, feel the full weight of what had just happened. Then the elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened, and I walked out into the cold February air with my coat buttoned and my grandfather's pearl earrings in my ears and $4,200,000 and 6.8 acres of East Hampton real estate in my name. And I turned toward the subway and I went home. My phone began ringing before I reached the corner. I did not answer it, but that night, something else happened. Something I had not anticipated. Something that did not come from Warren's office, or from my father, or from anyone in my family at all. It came from Gerald, my father's cousin, the one who had poured me sparkling water at Thanksgiving. The one who had caught my eye across the table when the album was presented, and then looked away, and who had, I later learned, been quietly furious about it ever since. His text arrived at 9:47 that evening. Lindsay. I was there that night. I saw what they did. If you ever need a witness to what was said at that table, I want you to know I remember every word. Call me whenever you're ready. I sat on my couch in Brooklyn with my phone in my hand, and I read that text 3 times. Then I set the phone down and looked at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, the city hummed its ordinary night sounds. A siren, distant. A bus. Someone laughing on the street below my window. I thought about my grandfather in his green armchair. The loudest people in a room, he had said, are always the ones most afraid of what the quiet people might be thinking. He had been right about that. He had been right about almost everything. The call from the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office came on a Tuesday, not to me, to Warren, first, as my legal representative, which was how I had asked it to be structured. Warren called me at 10 in the morning and explained, in his careful, measured way, that the DA's office had reviewed the forensic report and the financial institution's records and had determined there was sufficient basis to open a formal investigation into the attempted fraudulent use of a forged document. He said the process would take time. He said I should not expect anything dramatic in the near term. He said the relevant parties had likely already been contacted by the DA's office directly. He said I did not need to do anything except be available if contacted, which I would be in time. I thanked him and hung up and went back to the Carroll Gardens drawings, which were due to the clients by end of week. I had resolved the staircase problem. The kitchen layout was clean. There was a small issue with the rear bathroom ventilation that I spent the rest of the morning working through, and by noon I had a solution I was satisfied with. And I ate lunch at my drafting table and looked out the window at the February street below and felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a person whose life was proceeding in the direction she had chosen. I want to be precise about the weeks between the Friday reading and what happened in March, because they were quieter than you might expect, and the quiet was its own kind of thing. My father did not call me after the reading. Not that Friday, not the following week, not the week after. The calls that had been coming daily, the office line, the cell, the occasional unknown number that was always him, simply stopped. The silence was so complete and so sudden that it had a texture to it, like the way a room sounds different after a piece of furniture is removed. I noticed it, and then I stopped noticing it, and then one morning, I realized I had gone 11 days without checking my phone for his number, and that the absence of that reflex felt like putting down something I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten it had weight. My mother sent one email. It was 4 paragraphs long, and I read it once, standing at my kitchen counter with my coffee, and then I closed it and did not reply. The email did not apologize. It explained, at length, in the careful language of a woman who had spent 40 years managing the presentation of difficult things, that the Thanksgiving gathering had been misunderstood, that the album had been a tribute rather than an exclusion, that my father's announcement had been taken out of context, and that she hoped I would consider the family's feelings before making any decisions about the estate that might be difficult to undo. She did not mention the power of attorney. She did not mention the district attorney. She did not mention the $214,000. Brooke called once, on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the reading. I was at the Carroll Gardens site doing a walkthrough with the contractors, and I felt my phone vibrate and looked at the screen and set it back in my pocket. She left a voicemail. I listened to it that evening, 47 seconds. She said she needed to talk to me about the cottage. Her voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. Not anger, not the careful social performance of sisterhood she had practiced our entire lives, but something underneath both of those things. Something raw. Something that sounded stripped of everything, like a person who had just understood for the first time that the floor they had been standing on was not solid. She needed to vacate the cottage by the end of March. I had told Warren to send the formal notice. He had sent it the week after the reading, certified mail, with the relevant provisions attached. 90 days, per the legal requirements, the cottage would revert to the estate, to me, at the end of that period. I thought about calling her back. I sat with my phone in my hand for a while that Saturday evening, looking at her name on the screen, thinking about what I would say. I thought about the cream cashmere sweater at Thanksgiving, the inventory look around Edward's library. She doesn't know anything. The 43 photographs. I put my phone down. I was not cruel about it. I want to be clear about that. I did not want Brooke destitute. I did not want anyone in genuine suffering. But I had learned, slowly, and then all at once, over the course of that winter, that there is a difference between cruelty and consequence, and that confusing the two had cost me 32 years of positioning myself as the problem in situations I had not created. Brooke had a job. She had savings. I did not know how much, but I knew she had them. She would find another apartment. The cottage had been a gift she had treated as a right, and there is a particular lesson that comes from discovering the difference between those two things. And it was not my responsibility to protect her from it. March arrived cold and clear, the way New York March sometimes does before remembering it is supposed to be transitional. I had been to the East Hampton house twice since the reading, once with Warren to complete a formal inventory, and once alone on a Sunday, when I drove out without telling anyone and let myself in with the key Gloria had given me, and walked through the rooms slowly, one by one, the way you walk through a place you are learning to understand as yours. The library still smelled like cedar and coffee. The green armchairs were exactly where I had placed them, 6 years ago, the reading nook under the east window catching the thin winter light. The desk where Edward had signed 14 months' worth of careful, irrevocable decisions was clear and clean. Gloria had been in that week. I stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Then I went out to the garden. The hydrangeas were still cut to stubs. The groundskeeper, the same one Edward had kept for 20 years, had been in February to do the late winter pruning. He had sent me a note through Warren when he heard, expressing his condolences, asking politely whether I intended to maintain the existing planting schedule. I had written back and told him yes. Everything as Margaret had planned it. I was standing in the garden, looking at the water through the tree line, when my phone buzzed Gerald. We had spoken twice since his text the night of the reading. He was, as I had always suspected, a person of genuine decency who had spent years feeling vaguely complicit in something he could not quite name, and who felt, now that the thing had been named, a particular relief in no longer being complicit in it. He told me, in our first call, that he had known something was wrong for years. He said the Thanksgiving album had been the thing that finally made it impossible to look away from. This text was different. Lindsay, have you seen the listing? I read it twice. Then I typed back, what listing? His reply came in under a minute with a screenshot attached. I opened it. It was a real estate listing. The East Hampton property. Listed with a brokerage in Southampton. Described in the listing language as a generational estate property, motivated seller, rare East Hampton waterfront opportunity. The asking price was $7,400,000. The listing had gone live 4 days ago. I sat down on the garden bench. Margaret's bench, wrought iron, set at the end of the path where it faced the water, and I looked at the listing for a long time. My father had listed a property he did not own. He had contacted a real estate brokerage, represented himself as the owner or authorized agent of the East Hampton estate, provided them with sufficient information to generate a listing, and put 6.8 acres of land that had been legally mine for 14 months on the open market. I called Warren. He answered in 2 rings. I see it, he said. He had clearly already seen it. I've been on the phone with the brokerage this morning. They are, I think it's fair to say, very unhappy about their situation. Can they be held liable? They acted in good faith on representations made to them, Warren said. Their liability is a separate matter. What's relevant to you right now is that your father has now represented himself as having authority over this property in writing to a third party, after having been formally notified at the reading that the property belongs to you. He paused. This is not a gray area, Lindsay? No, I said. It isn't. The DA's office will be very interested in this development. I looked out at the water. Flat and gray-green, the same color it had been on every November morning I could remember. The same water my grandfather had looked at every day for 50 years. Warren, I said. I want to be there. A pause. There? When it happens, I said. When the consequences land. I don't want to hear about it afterward. I want to be in the room. Warren was quiet for a moment. I could hear him thinking, the specific quality of silence that meant he was weighing professional caution against what his client had actually asked for. There is, he said slowly, a mechanism for that. Your grandfather's estate is directly implicated in the fraudulent listing. You have standing as the estate's sole beneficiary to be present at any formal proceeding connected to assets under that estate. Another pause. I'll make some calls, thank you, I said. I stayed on the garden bench for a while after I hung up. The water moved. A gull appeared above the tree line and tilted into the wind and disappeared. I thought about my father printing that listing. Reviewing the photographs some agent had taken of rooms that were not his, approving the asking price, signing whatever authorization forms the brokerage required, believing with the specific blindness of a man who had never once seriously been told no, that he could simply proceed, that the mechanics of consequence did not apply to him, that even now, even after the reading and the forensic report and the district attorney's office and the briefcase bequest, he could look at a listing agreement and think, this will work. I thought about 32 years. I thought about 43 photographs. I thought about my grandfather's voice, in that library, in those green armchairs. People who believe they have already won stop paying attention to what you're actually doing. My father had never stopped believing he had already won. He had been paying attention to the wrong things for so long that he had no practice looking anywhere else. Warren called back at 4 that afternoon, Friday, he said. 10 o'clock. The brokerage's offices in Southampton. They've agreed to host the meeting. The DA's investigator will be present. I've been in contact with the brokerage's legal team, and they are, as I said, highly motivated to demonstrate their own good faith in this matter. A pause. Your father has been notified that there is a meeting regarding the estate listing. He has not been told you will be there. I looked at the Carroll Gardens drawing spread across my table, the clean kitchen layout, the resolved staircase, the rear bathroom with its newly solved ventilation problem. Good work, I thought. Patient work. The kind that holds up. I'll be there, I said. The brokerage offices were on a quiet street in Southampton, 3 blocks from the water, in a building that had clearly been a residential property in a previous life. Good bones, wide windows, the particular warmth of old wood floors under expensive renovation. The kind of space that communicated without trying too hard, that the people inside it dealt in significant things. I arrived at 9:40. Warren was already there, standing in the small reception area with his coat folded over his arm and his briefcase at his feet, talking quietly with a woman I recognized as the brokerage's managing director from the firm's website. Mid-50s, dark blazer, the composed expression of someone who had spent the week managing a situation she had not asked for and was determined to resolve efficiently. Her name was Catherine Marsh. She shook my hand with both of hers and said she was very sorry for the circumstances. And I believed her. The DA's investigator was a man named Reyes, compact and unhurried, with a yellow legal pad and a recorder he placed on the conference table without comment. He shook my hand. He had already spoken with Warren twice that week. We sat down at 10 minutes to 10. At 9:58, I heard the front door. My father came in first. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal wool one he kept for meetings in the city, and he had the look of a man who had spent the previous few days constructing a particular version of events and was prepared to present it. Behind him came Feldman, the White Plains attorney, carrying a briefcase and wearing an expression that suggested he had advised his client against attending this meeting and had been overruled. My mother was not with him. Brooke was not with him. My father walked into the conference room and stopped. He saw me. Something happened to his face that I had never seen before and have not seen since. A complete, unguarded collapse of composure, lasting perhaps 2 seconds before the reconstruction began. In those 2 seconds I saw, in sequence, surprise, calculation, and then a specific fear that was different from the fear I had seen at the reading. The reading had been about money and documents. This was something else. This was a man looking at his daughter across a conference table, in a room that also contained a district attorney's investigator and a recording device and understanding. With a clarity he could not talk his way around, that the situation was no longer theoretical. Feldman saw me at approximately the same moment. His expression did not collapse, it just closed. A professional door shutting, Miss Hughes, he said, with professional neutrality. Mr. Feldman, Warren said pleasantly. Good morning, please sit down. My father sat. He did not look at me again immediately. He looked at the table, then at Reyes, then at the recording device, then at Catherine Marsh, who gave him the polite, cool acknowledgement of a woman who was not particularly glad he was in her building. Rice identified himself and the nature of the meeting for the record. He outlined the facts efficiently and without editorializing. The listing of the East Hampton property, the authorization documents provided to the brokerage, the legal standing of the estate, as documented in the trust transfer, recorded with Suffolk County 14 months prior, the forensic findings regarding the power of attorney document, and the earlier attempt to access the estate's financial account using that same document. He read each item in a flat, factual voice. My father's attorney interjected twice. Both times Reyes acknowledged the interjection and continued reading. The third time Feldman began to speak, Reyes looked up from his legal pad and said, quietly, that he would be happy to schedule a separate session if Mr. Feldman preferred, but that this meeting's purpose was to establish the factual record rather than to debate it, and that the time for formal response would come through the appropriate legal channels. Feldman said nothing further. Catherine Marsh then spoke. She said the brokerage had acted in good faith on representations made to them regarding ownership of the property. She said the listing had been taken down within hours of their legal team's review of the estate documentation. She said the brokerage had fully cooperated with the DA's office and would continue to do so. She said this in the measured tone of a professional woman, making very clear, for the record, that her firm was not the party responsible for what was sitting across the table from her. Then Warren spoke. He outlined, methodically and without drama, the full scope of what had occurred. The trust transfer, the will, the forensic findings, the financial institution's records, the listing. He connected each element to the next with the quiet precision of a man who had been building this particular case for 7 years. Not because he had known it would come to this, but because Edward Hughes had asked him to be thorough, and thorough was what he was. When Warren finished, the room was quiet. Reyes made a note on his legal pad. My father had not spoken during any of this. He sat with his hands in his lap, not on the table, where they would be visible, and he looked at a point somewhere between the table surface and the window. The specific gaze of a person who is not looking at anything, because looking at anything would require acknowledging what surrounds them. Feldman leaned toward him and spoke briefly in his ear. My father nodded once without moving his eyes from that middle point. Then Feldman looked up. My client, he said, would like to make a statement. Reyes indicated that a statement was appropriate. My father raised his eyes from the table. He looked at Warren first, then at Reyes, then finally at me, and I watched him try to find the version of my face he had always been able to use. The one that flinched or appeased or looked away first, or produced the small retreat that told him he still had leverage. He looked for it the way you look for a light switch in a room you know well, automatically, not yet understanding that the room has been changed. It wasn't there. I looked back at him calmly. Warren had said, just calm. I had practiced it, but the truth was, it did not feel like effort anymore. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, sitting in a room where every document, every recorded fact, every legally filed piece of paper confirmed what I had always known about my own worth, and simply being still. My father opened his mouth. What came out was not a confession and not an explanation. It was something that had probably begun, in some earlier version of his thinking, as a justification, a narrative about family intention and estate misunderstanding and documents taken out of context. But it did not complete itself. It started, and then it did something I had never seen his voice do. It stopped. He stopped. He closed his mouth. He looked at his hands. Feldman said, quietly, my client will be providing a full response through appropriate legal channels. Rye said that was the client's right. Then something happened that had not been on any agenda. My father's phone, set to silent on the table in front of him, lit up. He glanced at it reflexively. The automatic response of someone whose phone has always brought news worth having, and I saw his face change when he read the screen. A different change this time. Not the collapse of composure from earlier, but something quieter and more complete. Something that looked very plainly like a person receiving the last piece of information they needed to fully understand the size of what they were in. Feldman glanced at the phone. His jaw tightened fractionally. Later, I learned what the message had been. My father's cousin Gerald, the one who had poured me sparkling water at Thanksgiving, the one who had texted me the night of the reading with his offer to testify, had that morning provided a signed statement to the DA's office, a detailed, witnessed account of what had been said at the Thanksgiving table. My father's announcement, the album, the words real family. 11 people present. Gerald had named 8 of them who he believed would corroborate. My father had built his entire strategy on the assumption that no one who had been in that dining room would say anything. He had not accounted for Gerald. He had not accounted for a lot of things. Rice concluded the meeting. He thanked everyone for their time. He said the investigation would continue and that the relevant parties would be contacted through proper channels. He picked up his recorder, he capped his pen. My father stood. His chair moved back from the table and he stood, and he was, for a moment, just a man in a good coat, in a room where nothing had gone the way he had planned for 30 years. And all the useful proximity, and all the careful positioning, and all the conversations about legacy and real family, and what Edward would have wanted, had reduced themselves to a briefcase bequest, and a district attorney's investigation, and a daughter who was looking at him from across a conference table without flinching. He moved toward the door. He passed within 3 feet of me. He did not stop. He did not speak. He walked out of the conference room and through the reception area and out the front door, and I heard his footsteps on the old wood floors, steady at first, and then faster, and then the door, and then nothing. Feldman paused at the threshold and looked back at Warren with the expression of a professional who has done everything he could for a client who had not made it easy. "Counselor," he said. "Counselor," Warren replied. Then Feldman was gone too. Catherine Marsh let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 40 minutes. She looked at me and then at Warren and said, "Well, just that." Warren made a small sound of agreement. Reyes had already packed his legal pad and was standing at the door. He looked at me briefly before leaving, not the look of an investigator at a witness or a subject, but the brief, direct look of one person acknowledging another. "Miss Hughes," he said. "Thank you," I said. He nodded and left. Warren and I sat in the conference room for a few minutes after everyone else was gone. Catherine Marsh brought us coffee, which was unexpectedly kind, and then excused herself. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the Southampton street was bright and cold, a February morning doing nothing in particular. "What happens now?" I asked. Warren wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The investigation runs its course. These things take time. The forged document, the attempted account access, the fraudulent listing, each of those is a separate matter, and each will be addressed separately. He paused. Your father's attorney is competent. He'll advise cooperation. The question is how much cooperation your father is capable of. I thought about my father in that room. The phone lighting up. The way he had stood from the table. Not much, I said. Warren made a small sound that was not quite agreement and not quite disagreement, but occupied the space between them accurately. I finished my coffee. I put on my coat. I thanked Catherine Marsh on my way out, and she pressed my hand briefly and said she hoped things would settle down for me soon, which was a kind thing to say, and which I believed she meant. Outside, the February air was sharp and clean. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Warren came out behind me, and we shook hands, and he said he would be in touch, and then he walked toward his car, and I stood there for another moment, alone, on a quiet Southampton street in winter. Then I took out my phone and called Gloria. She answered on the second ring the way she always did. Gloria, I said, I'm going to come out to the house this weekend. I want to start going through some things. I paused. And I want to talk to the groundskeeper about the garden. Margaret's planting schedule. I want everything ready for spring. Gloria said she would have the house ready. She said she was glad I was coming. I put my phone in my pocket and walked to my car. The drive to East Hampton took just over an hour, and I made it without the radio, in silence, the way my grandfather used to drive. Not because he didn't like music, but because he said some roads deserved to be listened to without distraction. I parked in the side lot, got out, walked around to the garden. Hydrangea stubs were still bare. Another month, maybe 6 weeks, before any visible growth. But underneath the frost-whitened soil, in the dark and the cold and the patient biological silence of a February garden, things were already beginning that you couldn't see from the surface. I stood at the end of Margaret's path, on Margaret's bench, and looked at the water. And I thought, spring is coming, and everything here is mine. 18 months later, I am writing this from the library. The green armchairs are exactly where I left them 6 years ago. When I was 26 and thought I was just doing a favor for my grandfather, and did not understand yet that I was making a room for myself without knowing it. The reading nook under the east window catches the morning light the way I designed it to. A low, warm angle in summer, direct and clear in winter. There is a cup of coffee on the side table, the same smell of cedar because I kept the cedar-lined shelving, and the same cleaning product Gloria has used for 19 years, because some things do not need to be changed, only kept. Outside through the library window, the garden is in full August bloom. Margaret's hydrangeas came back in May, not just adequately but spectacularly, the way they apparently do after a hard pruning, throwing out enormous mop-head clusters in white and pale blue, and a deep cornflower that I had not seen before, and that the groundskeeper, a man named Pete, who has the quiet authority of someone who has spent 20 years paying very close attention to one specific piece of land, told me Margaret had been cultivating for a decade before she died. The garden she left is more deliberate than it looks. There are layers to it. Things that bloom in sequence, things that provide structure in winter, things that attract particular birds in autumn. It took me 3 seasons of being here, really being here, before I began to understand what she had built. I take care of it the way she would have wanted. I think I am going to tell you what happened, and then I am going to tell you what I learned, and I want you to stay with me through both, because the second part is the part that matters. My father's legal situation moved the way legal situations move, slowly, then suddenly, then slowly again. The forgery charge was the clearest element, the forensic evidence being what it was, and Feldman eventually advised a negotiated resolution rather than a trial, which I was told was in everyone's interest, and which I accepted as true without being entirely glad about it. The fraudulent listing added a separate civil dimension that the brokerage pursued independently, and which resulted in a settlement I was not party to, but was briefed on in general terms. The attempted account access was the element that took longest to resolve, partly because it required establishing precise intent, and establishing intent in financial fraud cases is apparently the legal equivalent of describing fog. By the end, my father had pled to a reduced charge. He paid a substantial fine. He avoided prison, which was the outcome Feldman had been working toward from the beginning. and which I had complicated feelings about, that I processed over a long period with more honesty than I would have been capable of in an earlier version of my life. I did not want my father in prison. I did not particularly want him free and comfortable either. What I wanted was something the legal system cannot deliver, which is acknowledgement, the specific, direct, adult acknowledgement that what was done was wrong and that I had not deserved it. I never received that. I have accepted that I will not. My mother sent a letter in the autumn following the reading. 3 pages, handwritten, the careful cursive she had always used for things she wanted to appear sincere. I read it once. It was the most sophisticated non-apology I have ever encountered. Every sentence structured to perform remorse, while carefully avoiding the admission of any specific wrongdoing. She said she hoped we could find a way forward as a family. She said she thought of me often. She said she still had some of my things from childhood and asked what I would like to do with them. I sent Warren a brief note and asked him to handle the retrieval of any personal property. If there was any worth retrieving, which I doubted, I did not write back to my mother. Brooke vacated the cottage in late March, on the last day of the 90-day notice period. She left it clean, which I had not expected, and which told me something about her that complicated my feelings in a direction I was not entirely prepared for. She had left a note on the kitchen counter, 3 lines on a torn piece of paper, not an apology exactly, but something in the vicinity of one. She said she knew she had not been a good sister. She said she thought she had understood the family correctly, and that it turned out she had understood it the way my parents had taught her to, which was not the same thing. She said she hoped I would be all right. I kept the note. I have not responded to it yet. I am still deciding whether I will. I hired Pete's crew to do the cottage renovation I had been thinking about since February. Fresh paint throughout, new kitchen fixtures, the windows resealed against the coastal damp. It took 6 weeks and came in slightly under budget, and when it was done it looked, for the first time, like a place someone had genuinely cared for, rather than a place someone had been allowed to use. I have a friend from architecture school, a woman named Dara, who teaches at Columbia and spends every summer on the North Fork with her family, who has been staying in the cottage since June. She brings her 3 children and her husband, and they use the boathouse on weekends, and the garden fills up with the particular noise of children who are allowed to run, and I find I do not mind it at all. The Carroll Gardens project finished in April and was photographed for 2 publications and led to 2 new commissions, one of which is the most complex and interesting work I have done in my career. A complete interior renovation of a 1920s building in Hudson that its new owner wants restored with the same structural logic it was built with, which is the kind of problem that keeps me at the drafting table past midnight, not because I have to, but because I genuinely cannot stop thinking about it. I work at Edward's desk now, the library desk. I moved my drafting materials out here from Brooklyn when I made the decision in April to make East Hampton primary and keep the Brooklyn apartment for city weeks. Edward's desk is large and solid and has a surface that was made for spreading drawings across. And the morning light through the east window is exactly right, and Gloria brings coffee at 8:30 and sometimes sits at the small table by the door and reads while I work, and we have developed the easy companionship of 2 people who share a house and understand each other's rhythms, and it is, I want to say plainly, one of the best parts of my daily life. Gerald and his wife Patricia come for dinner every few months. He is the only member of my father's side of the family I see regularly, and our dinners have become something I look forward to in the way I look forward to very few social things. Specific, warm, honest in the way that meals between people who have been through something together tend to be. He told me once, over the remains of a late summer dinner on the porch, that he had known for years something was wrong, and that not speaking up was one of the things he was most ashamed of in his adult life. I told him that he spoke up when it mattered. He shook his head and said it should not have taken that long. I think he is probably right, and I think he knows that I know he is probably right, and we have arrived at the kind of understanding that does not require further discussion. I want to tell you something that I did not expect. The thing I did not expect was that the grief and the victory arrived together and were sometimes indistinguishable from each other. I won. I know that is the correct word for what happened. I won. Legally and financially, and in terms of the public record of what my family did, and what my grandfather chose, and what the documents say. I won in the way the story is supposed to end when the wronged person is finally seen and the truth is finally spoken, and the people who spent years erasing you discover that you were the one holding the pen the entire time. And some mornings I walk into this library and I see the green armchairs and the reading nook and the first editions on the shelves, and I feel the weight of all of it, and I miss my grandfather so specifically, so precisely. The navy cardigan, the way he held a mug, the patience in his voice when he was about to say something he had thought about for a long time. That I have to stand still for a moment until the feeling passes. He did not do what he did to give me a victory. He did it because he saw me clearly and acted on what he saw, and those are two things I spent 32 years believing were not available to me in my own family. The money matters. The house matters. But it is the being seen that I carry with me into every room. I have thought many times about what I would have done differently. The answer is almost nothing. Not because I was particularly wise, but because I did not know enough at any given moment to have made a better choice than the one I made, and I have made my peace with that. What I would do differently, if I could go back to some earlier version of myself, is this. I would tell her that the quiet is not a weakness, that leaving a room without slamming the door is not a defeat, that the person who stays steady when everything around them is performing and positioning and grasping is not the person who loses. She is the person that a certain kind of man, sitting in a green armchair, watches very carefully for a very long time, and then acts on. One morning in June, I went out to the garden early, before the heat settled in, and I found that the deep cornflower hydrangeas Margaret had spent a decade cultivating had spread along the south wall. More of them than the previous year, taller. The color so specific and so vivid that I stood in front of them for a long time, thinking about a woman I had loved and not known well enough, and lost before I understood what she had been building. I cut 3 stems and put them in a vase on Edward's desk. They are still there. If you have ever been made to feel like you did not belong in a room that was always yours, I want you to hear this. The record can be corrected. It takes time, and it takes someone willing to pay attention, and it takes you being steady enough, long enough, that the right person can see who you actually are. Stay steady. The rooms that belong to you are waiting. If this story reached you today, leave a comment and tell me what part stayed with you. If you have ever been the person in your family who was edited out, who was spoken over, who was handed the wrong version of the story, I see you. Hit like if this meant something to you. And if you are new here, subscribe, because there are more of these stories, and every single one of them ends with the truth coming out.